Hello everyone, my name is Gary Havelka from KolpinOutdoors. Today we're going to install the Kolpin SwitchBlade UTV plow system. As you can see, this system is very unique. It has everything in the box except for the winch assembly. Once you take everything out of the box, the assembly should take about an hour to install. One of the key features of the SwitchBlade plow system is, as you can see here, it has two unique different sizes that you can build it to. We're going to break the assembly into sections, so let's get started. To make the assembly easier, I've laid out the brackets and bolts necessary for the installation. It is important that you lay them out this way to make the assembly easier. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to take the outside bracket assemblies, lay them over the top of the inside bracket assembly, and we're going to install the two outside brackets. Now we're going to take our bolts and brackets and put them together, and we're going to take the inside blade assembly and lay it on the inside 4 screws. We're going to do the same with the outside blade parts, install them on the outsides. The next step, we're going to rotate the bracket assembly forward onto the same existing bolts over the blade. Now we're going to install loosely all the nuts on the back side, the 13mm bolts. At this point, we can take the center support bracket and lay it in between the 2 center bolts. Along with that, we can actually lightly install our skid shoes. Now we're going to rotate the blade forward and install these 4 bolts. Now we're going to tighten up the lower portion of the 12 bolts. You're going to torque these down to 17 foot-pounds. Now that I've tightened down the 12 lower bolts, we're going to move on to our next step. It's important that we did not tighten these bolts yet for later installation. All right, remember how we left these bolts loose? We're now going to install the plate onto the blade assembly. Leaving these bolts loose allows an easier ability to get your bracket in. We're taking our 18mm nuts and attaching them to the blade. Now we're going to go ahead and tighten them up. We're going to torque both of these nuts to 17 foot-pounds. Now that the pivot bracket is installed, we can go ahead and tighten the remaining nuts on the blade and bracket assembly. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Now that I've got the blade and plate assembly attached, we're going to move on to our next step. We're going to install our bracket assembly and hinge plate assembly to the bracket. We're going to take the 8mm bolt assembly, put it through the plate, and slide it through the hole supplied. We're going to now take this bracket, put it over the top, and lightly finger tighten the bolt. I'm now going to install the bolt on the back side of the bracket and also install the lever assembly. You have your spring first that you install on the back side of the bracket. There's a small hole for it. You install the other end to the back side of the lever and lightly pull into place. I'm now going to go ahead and tighten up all the bolts. Now that we have the bracket assembly tightened down, we're going to go ahead and install our springs and our blade stops. Now that we have the springs attached and the blade stops attached, we're going to go ahead and tighten down the blade stop bolts. Now that we have our springs and blade stops installed, we're going to go ahead and start installing our push tubes. To make it easier, we're going to tilt the blade forward and lay it like that. So let's go ahead and start mounting up our push tubes. We're going to take each push tube and line it up with the holes provided on the bottom of the bracket. We're going to take our screws and install them. The bottom bolt does not need a washer. The top one will put one of the flat washers provided on each side. Now we're going to go ahead and tighten the 13mm nuts. Now that we've installed the carriage bolts and torqued them down to 17 foot-pounds, we're going to go ahead and put on the tube extensions on the end here. We're going to go ahead and use the longer hex bolts and washers for this sequence. We're going to go ahead and mount these on, putting the screws through, making sure that the thread side faces downward. We're going to go ahead and put washers and 13mm nuts on each one. Now that we have the two extension tubes installed and torqued down, we're going to do our final plate and install it onto the tubes. Again, like before, we're going to take them and make sure that the screws are facing down. We're going to go ahead and attach the washers and the nuts onto the screws. Now that we have them on there, we're going to go ahead and tighten these down to 17 foot-pounds. Now that we have the plate installed and torqued down to specs, the switchblade and tube assembly is now installed. We're going to go ahead and install our universal mount to the machine. So the universal mount that we're going to be installing on the Polaris 570 Ranger, we're going to be using these two U-bolts and nuts and these two nuts and bolts. The remaining nuts and bolts that we're going to have here are going to be attached to the main universal mount. As you can see, I have the mounting plate and configuration set up on this machine right now. So we're going to go ahead and tighten up all the bolts. Just a reminder, I did remove the lower skid plate to access the frame assembly to put the U-bolts and other bolts in. So let's go ahead and tighten everything down. Now you can see that I have all the bolts tightened up to the frame assembly. So we're going to go ahead and attach the push tube to the mount. Now that we have the push tube underneath the machine, we're just going to lift up the push tube and slide in our pins. Now that we have the push tube and everything assembled to the machine, we're going to go ahead and hook up the winch and test it out and see how it works. Let's test out the different functions as far as angle adjustments. Make sure they all work okay. Just a reminder, the switchblade assembly is made for various different types of machines and configurations. So you will have some supplied brackets and nuts and bolts that will not be used on every configuration. If you have any questions on the installation, feel free to contact us at customer service@kolpin.com.